Hello everyone and welcome to this next chapter and the next set of chapters in which we will finally begin to have a look at the main line. So after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, short castle, the main move historically and still today is the move bishop e7. This is a very different approach, I would say, to the Archangelsk and to the open Spanish that we have seen already. Because bishop e7 is a move which signals that black is in for a classical fight. Black is not trying to, let's say, equalize by concrete means or try to immediately reach some sharp position, but rather to develop all the pieces, let's say, calmly, reach a standard classical position with lots of pieces on the board and a lot of play for both sides. With the exception of the martial attack, which is nowadays really regarded as a very serious concrete drawing attempt. But for us, this does not matter so much, because I have decided for this course to recommend the move d3. And that is, I would say, quite controversial, but also quite logical. So instead of rook e1, which is the main move, d3 is in style quite different, I would say. With d3, we are trying to just develop our pieces a little bit more calmly. We are intending to keep the pawn structure with the pawn on d3 and later the pawn on c3, and just sort of build up slowly. Later on we might push d4, it's indeed one of the main plans. But for the time being, we are starting out the game a little bit more calmly. I would say that when I started to play chess, or even longer ago, let's say some 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the move d3 on move 6 was considered completely harmless. And it was basically a way for white to just stay clear of any theoretical disputes. Nowadays, however, chess has developed a lot. And we have seen the emergence of slower systems which were previously considered quite inoffensive, like this one with 6d3, the whole Italian opening basically, and of course lots of openings in d4, like the London and so on. So we should not make the mistake of thinking that d3 is played as an sort of unambitious attempt to just get the pieces out. But it is an ambitious move, but it is a move. Like, I would say the ambition lies more in its strategic factors rather than the concrete ones. And that is why I like it, because I also think it ties quite well with the rest of the repertoire. Furthermore, of course, when we play d3, we also limit black's number of different openings. Like, if we were to play the main line with rook e1, there would be the marshal, which I consider to be the biggest issue for white. But there would also be the Breyer, there would be the Chigorin, there would be all sort of different Spanish setups, which we would have to know some theory and all. With 6d3, we are sort of the first to choose, although of course black has different options to face it. The main move for black after d3, we should first just note that d3 actually contains a threat. We are now threatening to take the knight on c6, followed by taking the pawn on e5, because we have protected the pawn on e4. Of course, this will never really happen in your games, because black will either defend the pawn immediately or start with the main move b5, which forces our bishop to b3. And I'm actually mentioning this specifically, that it forces the bishop to b3 while it looks quite obvious. It's actually quite an important factor in these positions, because if black were to wait one move and we would have the pawn on c3 already, then the bishop would retreat all the way to c2 in one move. So the big advantage for black to start with b5 already here is to force our bishop to b3. Now d6 is the main move, by far the most common move. And here it sort of starts, and here the explanations has to start as well, because now there are a couple of different ways to play for white. Sometimes they are very similar, sometimes they are a little bit different, but it's always important in these kind of positions to keep in mind the possible transpositions and keep in mind like the method of comparison between different lines and different move orders and so on. which I will try to do my best to explain. But I would like to state one thing before we begin with the, let's say, specific move order explanations, that in these lines in general, it is actually not that important to know everything by heart. This is much more about understanding. Of course, in any position, it's beneficial if we know it as well as possible. But this position is, in nature, one that can be played sort of, as they say, by hand, or it's a little bit easier than, for instance, the last couple of chapters, like the Open Spanish, the Archangels, those are quite sharp in nature. There it's more valuable to know it move by move, whereas here it's more about understanding. But still, of course, we should always aim to know what we are doing. So here, well, first of all, I will mention that the main line is to play a setup with a3, so creating a square for the bishop on a2, in case black threatens it with a knight, and then develop the knight to c3, and sometimes going to d5, and that is the most popular system, but I have decided to recommend systems always based on putting the pawn on c3, because I think this is a more pure Ruy Lopez structure, let's say, and it's also something that we will be able to do in all the lines, and it will be sort of creating quite a coherent repertoire. So I'm actually recommending starting with the move c3. And this is quite controversial, because I think already just a few years ago, let's say 5 years ago, I was playing the system with d3, and the move order with c3 here was basically frowned upon. It was considered inaccurate, or at least very inoffensive. But as I already mentioned, theory is developing, we understand new things, and now I consider it one of the more critical attempts for an advantage. The point of c3 is relatively clear. The bishop has a retreating square on c2 in case black plays knight a5. And one day we are, of course, intending to play d4. But this should be played in the right moment, because we are, of course, risking ending up just having lost the tempo by going first d3 and then d4. So, but we start with c3.